Imagine standing in the dark, in a marsh. The ground beneath your feet is soft and treacherous. The air smells of rot and cold water and wood smoke. Around you, perhaps a few hundred men, gaunt, hollow-eyed, wrapped in cloaks still damp from the last rain. They have been hiding for months, hunted, driven from their homes, from their halls, from the land their fathers bled to hold. The king among them does not look like a king. He looks like a man who has lost everything and has not yet decided whether to stop. And somewhere out there, beyond the tree line, beyond the frozen fens of Somerset, an army waits. An army that has done the unthinkable. An army that has come closer to erasing England than any force before or since. Now listen, this is not a story about a battle. This is a story about the last moment before a people ceased to exist. And the one man, and the one army, and the one day that pulled them back from the edge. If you care about the kind of history that actually changed the shape of the world, stay with us. Subscribe, and let us go back together to the year 878. To a hill called Edington, to the day England survived. To understand what happened at Edington, you first have to understand what had already been lost. Because by the time Alfred gathered his men in the Somerset marshes, the England we know was barely a flicker. A candle in a storm. Think about that. Everything that would come after. The literature, the law, the very idea of an English people. All of it balanced on the survival of one exhausted king and a handful of men who had every reason to give up and did not. The Vikings had arrived decades before, and they had not come merely to raid. The old raids, the lightning strikes on coastal monasteries, the longships vanishing back into the fog, those were an earlier age. By the middle of the 9th century, a new kind of Norse force had emerged. The chroniclers called them the Great Heathen Army, and the name was not an exaggeration. This was not a war band. It was a civilization in motion. Warriors, yes, but also settlers, commanders, political strategists. Men who had looked at the fractured kingdoms of England and seen not enemies to plunder but a land to inherit. They landed in East Anglia in 865. Within 4 years they had taken York. Within a decade they had shattered the kingdoms of Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia. King Edmund of East Anglia had been captured, tied to a tree, and shot through with arrows until he died. The kings of Northumbria had fallen, and now only one English kingdom remained, Wessex, Alfred, his kingdom, the last wall standing. And yet here's where history turns strange and extraordinary, because in the winter of 878, even Wessex almost fell, not through lack of valor, but through the oldest weapon in warfare, surprise. The Danish king Guthrum launched a midwinter raid on the 6th of January, the Feast of Epiphany, a date when no attack was expected, when men were feasting, when the cold and the holy calendar made the thought of war feel distant. Guthrum, his forces swept through Wessex like a blade through linen. The resistance collapsed. The Anglo-Saxon citizen militia scattered. Alfred, king of the West Saxons, the last English king, found himself a fugitive in his own land. He disappeared into the marshes of Somerset, into a place called Athelney, the Isle of Princes, a patch of raised ground surrounded by wetland that could barely be found by those who did not already know the way. He was, by any conventional measure, finished. And yet Athelney was not a grave. It was a forge. Think about that moment. We have a king in a swamp. He has perhaps a bodyguard, a handful of loyal thanes, his family. The Church of Wessex has been scattered. The administrative apparatus of his kingdom has been disrupted or destroyed. He does not know if his people will come back to him. Medieval chroniclers later preserved a story, almost certainly embroidered, possibly true in its soul if not its detail, of Alfred sheltering in the hut of a peasant woman who asked him to watch her cakes over the fire. He let them burn. He was too deep in thought about the fate of his kingdom. It is the kind of story that survives because it touches something real. The image of a king reduced to nothing, sitting by a fire, thinking about everything he had to rebuild. Humble, but not broken, because Alfred was not simply waiting to be rescued by circumstances. He was working. He was sending messages through the marsh country, rallying men, rebuilding the army he would need. He was rethinking what it meant to defend a kingdom. The old methods had failed. Something new would have to emerge. When the call went out, they came, the men of Somerset, the men of Wiltshire, the men of Hampshire, the feared of Wessex, part-time soldiers who were also farmers and craftsmen, answering the summons of their king. The meeting point was Egbert, a stone, a landmark on the border of the ancient kingdoms, a name that carried the weight of ancestral identity. And when Alfred arrived, the chroniclers tell us, his men greeted him with joy. Not merely duty, joy. Because a king who has survived what Alfred survived, who has remained in the fight when every rational calculation said to submit, becomes something more than a man. He becomes proof that resistance is possible, proof that the cause is not yet dead. And they came to him at Egbert, his stone, and they were ready. What happened next was a march. From Egbert, his stone, Alfred led his reunited army northward and eastward toward the place where Guthrum, his Danish forces, were encamped. The march itself was a statement. For months the English had been invisible, hiding, scattering, submitting. Now they were moving in the open. The feared of Wessex, shields on their arms, spears in their hands, moving toward the enemy who had scattered them into the dark. There is something almost unbearable about imagining that march. Men who had lost their farms to Viking settlement, whose neighbors had bent the knee to Danish lords, walking through a landscape remade by conquest, walking anyway, walking toward the fight. The battle that would determine everything was fought on a hill, Edington, in Wiltshire, on a stretch of high ground above the Vale of Pewsey, in the spring of 878, likely in May, when the ground was firm enough for the engagement Alfred needed. And what Alfred needed, understood it with a general clarity, was a decisive, pitched battle. Not a skirmish, not a harrying raid. He needed to destroy Guthrum's army in the open field, because only that kind of victory would be large enough to change the strategic situation entirely. Guthrum had to be not merely inconvenienced but defeated so completely that the will of the Danish host to continue the conquest was broken. That is the calculation of a commander who is thinking beyond the next hour, beyond even the next day. Alfred had learned something in the swamp. He had learned how to think like a man who intends to win the war, not just survive the battle. The Anglo-Saxon sources describe the engagement with the compressed, almost iconic language of medieval military writing. Alfred fought against the entire Viking army, and through the mercy of God, he overthrew it with great slaughter and pursued the survivors to the fortress, and took everything outside the fortress. He then besieged it for 14 days. 14 days. Not a morning, not an afternoon. A siege that lasted 2 full weeks. Alfred's army encircling Guthrum, his surviving forces, cutting off supply, grinding the Danish host down not with continuous assault but with the patience of a man who had spent months in a marsh learning to wait. It is a detail that tells you everything about how Alfred had changed. Any king can win a battle in the heat of the moment, when the blood is up and the adrenaline carries men past fear. But 14 days of cold, methodical siege, maintaining the pressure, maintaining the unity, maintaining the will, that requires a different order of command entirely. And it worked. Guthrum sued for peace. The terms Alfred extracted were extraordinary. Not merely a truce, not merely payment of tribute, but a transformation. Guthrum would accept baptism as a Christian. Alfred himself would stand as godfather at the ceremony. The Danish king would take a Christian name, Athelstan, and would withdraw his forces from Wessex into the territory that became known as the Danelaw. And Guthrum kept his word. He did not betray the treaty. He ruled his territory as Athelstan until his death. The war between Guthrum and Alfred was over. England, the idea of England, the possibility of England, had survived. Now think about what happens next. Because Alfred did not simply win a battle, he remade a civilization. In the years following Edington, he undertook a program of reconstruction so ambitious and so systematic that it would not be paralleled in English history for centuries. He rebuilt and fortified a network of burhs, fortified towns, across Wessex, positioned so that no part of the kingdom was more than a day's march from a defensible position. He reorganized the fyrd so that half the able men were always available for military service while the other half maintained the farms. He rebuilt the fleet, creating the beginnings of English naval power. And then, perhaps most remarkably for a man whose first concern had to be survival, he undertook a program of intellectual and cultural renewal that was almost unbelievable in its ambition. He had scholars brought to his court from across the Christian world. He learned Latin as an adult. He personally translated key texts into Old English, because he understood that a people who could not read the foundations of their own civilization in their own language were a people who could be unmade. He established schools. He began the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the first sustained historical record in the vernacular language of any European people, which would be maintained for centuries after his death. Think about that. A man who spent months as a fugitive in a swamp used that survival as the foundation for one of the most extraordinary projects of civilization building in medieval European history. Alfred did not just save Wessex. He saved the idea of an English people. He created the conditions in which his son Edward and his grandson Athelstan could complete the unification of England. Athelstan became the first king to rule all of England, the first to call himself Rex Anglorum, King of the English. But the foundation was laid at Edington. The foundation was laid in the marsh. And here's what we owe the warriors who held that shield wall. We should be precise about who they were. They were not professional soldiers in the modern sense. They were farmers and craftsmen and minor nobles who had answered a call from a king who had spent months in a swamp. They had every reason not to come. The Danish army had already shown what happened to kingdoms that resisted. The kingdoms of Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia were object lessons in the cost of defiance. Submission was possible. Life under Danish rule was possible, as many English people had already discovered. The men who came to Egbert, the stone, and marched to Edington chose not submission but the harder thing. They chose the fight. And that choice, made by tired men in a cold spring, motivated by loyalty and faith and whatever it is in human beings that refuses to accept the erasure of everything they know, changed the world. The shield wall itself demanded exactly this quality of purposeful endurance. It was not a formation for the reckless. It required that men stand shoulder to shoulder, overlapping their shields, holding the line even when the pressure from the opposing wall became almost unbearable. When the noise and the weight and the exhaustion all combined into something beyond ordinary human tolerance. The shield wall broke when men broke, when the psychological pressure exceeded the bonds of training and loyalty and will. What Alfred's men had at Edington that Guthrum's forces may not have fully understood was the particular ferocity of men fighting for something they cannot afford to lose. Guthrum's army was formidable, battle-hardened, experienced, the force that had already destroyed 3 English kingdoms. But Alfred's men were fighting for the last inch of ground. There is a kind of desperation that becomes its own form of power. And on the hill at Edington, that power held. Alfred died in 899, at around 50 years of age, old by the standards of his era, especially for a man who had spent so much of his life under the physical strain of warfare and chronic illness. He had suffered, apparently from his youth, from some condition the sources describe but do not precisely name. He endured it through the campaigns, through the marsh, through the siege, through the 20 years of reconstruction that followed. And not just endured, he built. He handed to his son a kingdom that was more organized, more defensible, more culturally coherent than anything that had existed in England before. Here's the lesson that Edington teaches, and it is a lesson that has no expiry date. The most consequential victories in human history are rarely the ones that were inevitable. They are the ones that almost did not happen. The ones that required someone to choose, in the dark and the cold, with the marsh water rising around their feet and the enemy somewhere out there in the tree line, to keep going. Alfred kept going. His men kept going. And England kept going. And we are still here, still speaking, still the inheritors of a survival that was never guaranteed. The English language, which is the language of Shakespeare and Newton and the internet and this very narration, might not exist, or might exist only as a dialect, a remnant, preserved in some corner of a Scandinavian-ruled island. Instead, because a king did not give up in a swamp, because men answered a summons at Egbert, a stone, because a shield wall held on a Wiltshire hill in the spring of 878, it became the most widely spoken language in human history. Think about that the next time you speak. Every word you say in English carries that survival in it. Every sentence is, in some small and distant and real way, a continuation of what was decided at Edington. The warriors who held that line, whose names we mostly do not know, the farmers and craftsmen and minor thanes who showed up because their king asked them to, they are as much the authors of the language you think in as any poet or scholar who ever lived. They held the line, and the line held, and everything that followed flows from that single choice, made by exhausted men, on a spring morning, more than 1100 years ago. The Alfred Jewel, A small, extraordinary object discovered in Somerset in 1693. A figure rendered in enamel beneath polished crystal and framed in gold. Almost certainly one of the jeweled Essels Alfred sent to his bishops to mark their place in the books he had translated. Sits today in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. It has survived 1100 years to look back at us from the 9th century. Hold that image. A jewel made to mark a place in a book, sent by a king who had once burned cakes in a swamp, saying across the centuries, "Read this. This matters. We are still here." Drop a comment. Which moment do you think was the real turning point? The survival at Athelney, or the victory on the hill at Edington?